I was looking on Henry's website and he writes, I had a ludicrous amount of fun writing this book. And then he says, the book is made solely with pure, unbleached, extra virgin Henry voice, baked in its own Henry voice juices with a scoop of raw, unpeeled Henry voice right on the top. And what I'm hoping today is I want that marinated, scooped, raw, grated, pure, extra virgin. That's what I want. I want that. I actually, not only do I want that from you, I think that's what I want.
Hello and welcome. I'm PJ Manney, and this is my co-host,
Laura Tenenbaum. Hi, everyone.
and this is our podcast, Love Letters to the Future. And today we have a remarkable writer and teacher and general communicator. He even writes his own songs for his own books, Henry Lien. He's here today because, as you all know, we talk a lot about the stories that are no longer working for us in a culture, the stories we think might help us create a better future, and the acknowledgement that there are many ways to tell a story. Henry has written a fantastic book, and I'd love him to introduce himself and the book, and we'll start to dissect his entire thesis about how we tell stories East versus West. Hello, Henry.
Hello. Hello, podcast viewers and listeners. My name is Henry Lien. I am an author originally from Taiwan, now living in Hollywood, California, and I write speculative fiction, which is a fancy way to say science fiction and fantasy. And I also have written a nonfiction book called Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, The Art of Eastern Storytelling, which is all about the ways that different cultures construct different shapes of stories as a deeper way to dive into culture and what we use diversity to describe. But it's really an exploration into the ways that we are different rather than the ways that we are the same.
Can I just interrupt before a question? So, Henry, on the audio, you hear a lot of clicking.
Okay.
So everything is perfect. I just wanted you to stop clicking if you can.
I think it's my beard.
Your beard is clicking?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
You have
Okay,
a clicky little beard.
I do, yeah. I'll try not to move, okay?
We use stories in very important ways because they don't only inform how we see our culture, but they also inform how we solve our problems. So this is why I find your book so intriguing and your entire thesis so important. And disclaimer, I actually took a class from Henry in this Eastern storytelling structure. So I'm going to, Laura, do you have any other specific questions?
Actually, I wanted to read a little excerpt from Henry's website. Again, PJ has met Henry before. I have not, so I'm like you, people who are watching and listening. But I was looking on Henry's website and he writes, I had a ludicrous amount of fun writing this book. And then he says, the book is made solely with pure, unbleached, extra virgin Henry voice, baked in its own Henry voice juices with a scoop of raw, unpeeled Henry voice right on the top. And what I'm hoping today is I want that marinated, scooped, raw, grated, pure, extra virgin. That's what I want. I want that. I actually, not only do I want that from you, I think that's what I want.
There's no adult supervision on my website. I'm able to be the freak that I really am and fly that freak flag high and proud. I'm a big fan of enthusiasm. And I'm a big fan of leaning into yourself and making stories more themselves. And I teach writing at institutions including UCLA Extension's Writers Program, Clarion West, Writing the Other. And one of the things that I look at is how can we make this story more itself? And so I'm interested in ways that stories are different and how we can shove stories out of the safe, conservative center that we huddle in because of cultural inertia or because of insecurity or because nobody's ever given us the permission to write a different shape of story or a story that's about something other than rising self-esteem, individual heroism. And so I'm very much a fan of allowing people to fly their freak flags high and proud.
That's awesome. And I'm just going to say that personally, what did you call it? The core of conservative sane sounded so boring. And just for me, stories are, they give us meaning, but they also are entertaining at the core of it. It's entertaining, which is why we want them so badly.
Yeah.
And if a story's boring, it's not entertaining.
Yeah. That entertaining part. I mean, I think about this on like a species level, and I'm not an anthropologist, not a biologist, but I feel like we are wired for stories, regardless of culture, regardless of the shape of the story that we receive as satisfying. We are wired to receive information more effectively and permanently in story form. And we all know this because any politician or rabbi or priest or imam can be droning on, and the eyelids are all just drooping. And all she has to do is say, "Now let me tell you a story." And she can repackage that same information, but in story form, in narrative form. And then suddenly we're all awake, and suddenly it penetrates and it sticks. And I think that we're just wired as a species to learn information through story form.
And I can absolutely agree with that because I've written articles on the neuroanatomy and neuropsychology of stories as empathy engines. It's 100% correct. It's not just a feeling. It is literally how we're wired and what made us a social species and what made us succeed as species. I would love you to explain to our audience the meaning behind the title of the book and what it's about.
The title of the book is Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, the art of Eastern storytelling. And Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird examines a number of different storytelling structures, one of which is the East Asian 4-act structure. So I don't want to give a lecture about Western 3-act structure. What I want to say is that this is fundamentally a seemingly strange structure where you deliberately hold back one of the main elements in the story until after the halfway point. I mean, so just imagine if there was this play called Romeo and Juliet, and the entire first half of the play is about this guy named Romeo and only about this guy named Romeo until after the halfway point, kapow! We get this entirely new character introduced for the first time named Juliet. And most Western audiences would just recoil and say, well, that's not Romeo and Juliet. That's Romeo then Juliet. Because there isn't symmetry, because the main elements aren't all tidily introduced to you with a polite handshake at the beginning of the story. The East Asian 4-act structure deliberately holds back a main element and drops it on you after the halfway point. And so the title of the book itself, Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, takes place in the late Cretaceous period, and it falls around a bird and a dinosaur and their quiet lives until the asteroid strikes, which was a surprise. They didn't realize that this was a main element in their life story. Nothing on Earth realized that this was a main element in the story of life on Earth. And that is the equivalent of the surprise that comes late in every 4-act structure story. You hold back something and you drop it on the story and see what chaos ensues. You break your own story, and then you look at what were the invisible connections lying in plain view all this time that you didn't see before until something came and smashed your assumptions. That's the 4-act structure. And the title itself, Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, is meant to demonstrate this structure in a tiny 4-word poem.
That's so interesting. Maybe PJ has a question, but what's the impact of the 4-act structure on the audience, the consumer?
Yeah, I love this question because people say, well, why would you do that? Why would you change the story on
Well,
people?
I'm
Why
not
wouldn't you
asking
warn
that.
people?
I'm not saying why would you do that? I'm actually saying that's so interesting. What I'm curious about what the impact is because the impact on a 3x structure is like beginning, middle, of end, and there's a bow and there's a certain comfort in the threes, and it feels ba 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 ba. There's something about that. So we know that, right? Okay, yawn, yawn, yawn. It still works sometimes, but like so I'm not complaining about the 4x structure. I'm actually saying, wow, cool. How does that impact the consumer of this 4x structure in ways that are delicious?
There is a huge advantage to this structure. The interruption is an opportunity for empathy because the characters in a four-act structure story, like the bird and the Tyrannosaurus that are the main characters of this little standalone story within my book about this little bird and this Tyrannosaurus living in the late Cretaceous period, they don't know that they are in an East Asian four-act story. And they don't know that something is about to come and destroy every assumption that they had. And if the characters don't know it, they receive that unexpected, unwelcome element with great shock and surprise. If the reader or the viewer doesn't know it's coming either, and it's not foreshadowed, and we don't get some establishing shot at the beginning. We're seeing this giant rock tumbling in space. We get no forewarning that this is coming. The upside of it is that we receive that element in the story when it comes with as much shock and surprise as the main characters, and thus we're able to feel more what they feel. We're able to empathize with them more. The four-act structure is fundamentally an engine for empathy, to exaggerate the empathy by giving the reader or the viewer no more warning than the characters get. That's the real advantage of it.
Cool. Okay, we're done with the podcast. We can go.
That is it's such a brilliant mechanism because it just fast tracks that empathy, that being in their shoes, that how would I react? How did they react? Do they react in a way that makes me go, that's the way I want to react? Or do they react in a way that makes me look at that as the cautionary tale? Oops, don't react that way because it will end badly for everyone. This is fantastic. I think we should also mention that there is a name by which the structure is commonly discussed that's Japanese, and you may want to dissect that.
Yes, the most common term for the East Asian four-act structure here in the West is its Japanese name, which is Kishotenketsu. Kishotenketsu. And each of those words corresponds to one of the four acts in the structure.
Which is a very neat.
Yeah, it's very neat. Do you want to go through? Does each of those words mean something that can be translated?
Yes.
I'm interested in that.
The first act, the key act, is the introduction of the elements. So let's go with an actual example from my book, this short story called Spring Summer Asteroid Bird, within the book Spring Summer Asteroid Bird. And we are introduced to the main characters. There are two main characters. One is named Chelsea, and she's a bird. And one is named Marilyn, and she's a Tyrannosaurus. And they are very distant cousins in the theropod family of dinosaurs, which also includes A-lister Velociraptor. And they have so little in common, but they are very distant cousins. So the key first act sets up what the elements are. We know who the main characters are. We know when this is taking place. We know where it's taking place. We know what kind of story this is. This is kind of a David Attenborough day in the life of nature type of documentary. The second act is show, where we just develop those same elements. No rush, no rising tension, no escalation. And so in the second act in this short story within my book, Chelsea lays her first clutch of eggs, and her cousin Marilyn couldn't care less. Okay, so same elements, these two characters, very distant cousins, have nothing in common, really don't care about each other. Okay, so that's the second act, the show act, where you develop the same elements that were previously introduced. The third act, the 10 act, is where you drop the new element. And in this case, it's an asteroid. An asteroid slams into the Earth and ends most life on Earth. It's the new element that was not foreshadowed in any way. It's the great surprise. It's the great disruptor of the story. And it seems to be the end of the story for most life on Earth. The fourth act is the Ketsu act, which is the harmonizing of all of the elements. And by harmonizing, I don't necessarily mean a peaceful resolution of whatever conflict existed in the story. No, what I mean by harmonizing is the mapping out of the invisible interrelationships among all the elements that came before, including the surprise element that came so late in the story. And in my short story, the asteroid revealed some things. It revealed relationships between Chelsea and Marilyn. It revealed relationships between being massive and being tiny, between having fangs and having a beak, between eating meat and eating seeds. Because after the asteroid struck and the sun was blotted out for 2 years or more, of course, all the plant life died, which meant all the herbivores died, which meant all the carnivores died, which meant the bigger you are, the faster you die. However, seeds remained edible for years and survived heat and cold, and they were plentiful, and they were packed with nutrients, and they were everywhere, but you had to have a beak to eat them. The Tyrannosauruses, with their fangs and their giant mouths, had no ability to eat the nutritive seed lying around them. So that asteroid revealed that these seeming disadvantages of this tiny little bird were actually massive advantages that ensured her survival, and now her descendants are the most populous species on Earth. So that asteroid revealed that the relationships among these seeming disadvantages and advantages, no, we actually had it upside down. Being small, having a beak, eating seeds were massive advantages. And that's what the fourth act, the Ketsu act, does. It shows the invisible relationships that were cracked open by the third act asteroid.
Wow.
I love that. It's
Wow.
it's so extraordinary because those invisible relationships are the ahas of a story, right? It's the things that have not been seen or that are revealed, that are the epiphanies, the ahas. And I find it fascinating that Asian cultures have put such a strong emphasis on that as the actual lever of the story, whereas in Western culture, 3-act structure, escalation is the engine of the story. You know, you may have an inciting incident, that's the thing that sets it off, but it says something very fundamental, perhaps, about how these different cultures function.
I think that you have your finger on something quite profound. And I think it's pretty to think that people are people around, all around the world, that we are fundamentally the same. And maybe this is a matter of definition, but I think that there are deep differences in worldview that answer your question about why these stories are so very different in their shape. And I'm not a theologian, I am not a philosopher, but that's not going to stop me from having an opinion about this stuff. I feel that East Asian cultures are, as a generalization, more collectivist in emphasis than individualist in emphasis. More concerned about the communal body, the societal body, than the individual and the individual's fulfillment, development.
I agree with that. I mean,
Okay.
I lived in Southeast Asia for 7 years, and I remember being in a classroom. I was a model and for an art class, and I had modeled for art classes in the West as well. And when the teacher would ask a question in the Western classes, the students would be like, pick me. And in the
Uh,
Asian classes, nobody wanted to stand out. And they knew the answer. It was just considered that's just, I have many stories like this, but it was looked down upon to show off.
yeah,
And to act like a know-it-all.
yeah.
And it was more important that everybody understood, and we were all in this together, and we were a group.
One of the things I'm struck by, as someone who has spent my life studying Eastern philosophy, what I love is the randomness, or the sense of you don't know what's going to happen next, and it's how you deal with it that matters. Like, that's such a key point to Kishotenketsu.
Yeah.
Whereas, yes, plot and how you react to the story reveals character in Western stories. This is different because it's not the hero choosing to take up the mantle of heroism. It's, I'm dropped in the middle of something that's way beyond what I expected, and now how do I act?
And then something gets dropped on top of you.
Right, exactly. It's a really deep difference that I love.
Well, I do. I do too. The older I get, the more wisdom I see in it, and I have some personal stories regarding this as well. But I think that, I mean, from a religious and philosophical standpoint, I think where it comes from is it comes from Buddhism and Taoism's emphasis on relinquishing of expectation, relinquishing of agenda, relinquishing of individual will. Not that those things are per se unimportant, but that they can cloud our ability to respond to the unexpected things that life is inevitably going to throw in front of our wheels, to respond to them with greater grace. When we are locked with laser focus on our expectations, on our agenda, on our individual will, we might not be able to be as flexible or see that unexpected asteroid that arrived in our plans actually came bearing some kind of gift. When we are so focused on what we expected, we just become ossified. And when that thing hits, we are not able to bend with it. We break. It breaks us. And I think that is where it comes from, in my opinion. That's where this structure comes from. And to go back to collectivism and what Laura was saying regarding the experience in classrooms, the unit is an organism, and that can include, maybe not your favorite person. How can you have a relationship with everybody in this unit, even if you don't like everybody in this unit? And this is built into the 4-act structure, because you are, like right off the shelf, you're going to get something that does not belong. One of these things does not belong. One of these things is not a bird or a member of the theropod family. One of these things is a 6-mile wide asteroid as big as Manhattan. One of these things does not belong. How do you have a relationship with everybody in your community, including that 6-mile wide chunk of rock that you seemingly have no relationship with? How can you have a relationship with it? I think that that's partly where this structure comes from. It's asking, it's like doing a stress test for your ability to create a community, even with this unexpected intruder into your community that comes so late, when you got so comfortable with which way you thought was up and which way you thought was down, what you thought were advantages and disadvantages. What do you do with the late intruder who comes barreling into your story? Is it going to break everything, or are you going to find it has a relationship with everything.
This is why, well, first of all, I created this podcast in large part because of you, whether you realize that or not.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah. So,
good.
and this will come back to exactly what you're saying. Community is central to the idea of the new mythos. And because our stories have always been so much about individuals, especially since the Enlightenment, when we talk about the mythic changes that have happened, we started to center Western stories more and more powerfully on the effect on the individual and the individual's needs and desires and rights as being paramount to the community. And in a sense, it was a reaction against, people being used as cogs and machines during the Industrial Revolution, or a reaction against the, millennia of religious dominance and persecution, or monarchical structures, whatever those aspects were, and the rise of democracy, things like that. So community is like the thing that got ignored in the West over the last couple of hundred years at least. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was I wanted originally to tell the story of why the new mythos was so important. And I wanted to talk about you and your work in elucidating Asian forex structure. And I thought, then why am I writing about it? Why don't I just have Henry come on and talk, and then have everybody come on and talk? Because this stuff is so important. And community is so, to me, one of the core values of the new mythos. You can still have the individual. It doesn't have to be purely communitarian, because in story, there's a balance to me. But you do get this larger sense that those who know how to work within the community are going to do better than those who don't work within the community. I had to share that because this is such, to me, this is such a crucial part of how we have to start reanalyzing the stories we tell. So I have to throw out this very important question because I know our audience is going to ask this in the comments. What about cultural appropriation? What about accusations of that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. In my opinion, everybody is welcome to study this because of how I define cultural appropriation. Now, definitions are everything, but I define cultural appropriation as the arbitrary cherry picking of cosmetic elements of a culture not your own, while simultaneously failing to understand core differences, appreciating the ways that cultures are fundamentally different. That doesn't mean that there is no overlap, there are no universal values, but it's the Western animated film that takes place in some non-Western location with characters with non-Western names in a place that has a non-Western name, maybe with voice actors of color. But as soon as that main character opens her mouth, she sounds exactly like every American teenager talking back to her parents, running into the ocean and ripping off her clothes and singing an I Want song. That's cultural appropriation, in my opinion. But what we're doing here in discussing the ways that something as fundamental as the shape of a story can be different culture to culture, that's the opposite of plucking cosmetic, trivial, superficial aspects of a culture, not our own, while failing to understand core differences. No, we're going right to the core differences. And for that reason, in my opinion, I welcome everybody, regardless of lived experience, regardless of background, to explore these ideas. You have my permission, at least.
That's wonderful. But then how do you feel about someone who's a Western writer working in 4X structure?
Absolutely zero problem. I mean, these are solutions that creators will arrive at independently. The way that nature will spontaneously develop an eye down different evolutionary tracks. The same good, solid solutions present themselves to ingenious creators over and over again, regardless of their own lived experience, their exposure, their knowledge, their culture. Some things just make sense. Sometimes you don't want to foreshadow what is going to happen. Sometimes you want to emphasize the empathy in the surprise in the characters. And then lo and behold, you've created a 4-act structured story. And I can think of some of it. Maybe, let me think. Let me think of an example that I highly admired. Okay, I will first start with one that's not my favorite book, but is a very, very good example, and that is Roald Dahl's Matilda. Absolutely 4-act structure. You know, there's one kind of story for the first half where it's, you know, it's a neglected, misunderstood kid at a very a brutal school, and then you hit the middle point, and then suddenly she has telekinesis, you know, and it becomes an entirely different story. And this is not foreshadowed. So there, Roald Dahl arrived himself independently at the 4-act structure. An even better example is my most rewatched film, Mulholland Drive, written and directed by David Lynch. It is absolutely in this same structure. And if you've seen it, you'll know what I mean. Something happens late in the story that turns everything upside down. And I don't know if Roald Dahl or David Lynch had ever even heard of the 4-act structure, but they arrived at them independently because they were creators and they needed a solution for this particular story. And nobody has a monopoly on, you know, great inventions for a particular problem. So I have no problem with that.
Yeah, that answers a question that I had. I was wondering if certain stories lend themselves to certain structures, and you basically just answered it.
And I also think that Western audiences need to know that some of their very favorite movies of all time are this structure. That, you know, beyond movies that were made in the East. Like, we can all think of all the Studio Ghibli movies or Parasite or Drive My Car, but, you know, I'm sorry, Laura, I'm bringing it up again. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
PJ's favorite movie.
Yeah, I mean, it is my favorite movie. I think it is the most perfect. I think Everything Everywhere All at Once is the most perfect expression of the new mythos of any film. And there are a bunch of films that are fantastic examples, whether it's Barbie or the animated Spider-Man, or you know, there's a number of great films there that have become wildly successful that are new mythos, but specifically Kishotenketsu, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is my favorite movie of the last at least decade, is such a perfect example of all the things we're going to be talking about on this podcast. And actually, what I think is so great about Everything Everywhere in this regard is you think you're watching a Western movie, and yet you're not. And it's I mean, I would actually love you to discuss, because I know you've discussed this in other contexts, the idea of circular, spiral, nested structures within this kind of structure, because that's an Everything Everywhere hallmark.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Everything Everywhere All at Once, it is such a landmark film in so many ways, because here was a movie, you know, made by and for geeks that stormed the Oscar citadel. You know, it planted the geek flag
Totally.
for us. And it was so uncompromisingly weird. But a couple points about this. So you mentioned the nested or circular storytelling structures, and this is another structure that I look at in my book, Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird. It is also about non-linear stories that are circular in shape, or nested tales within tales, like The 1001 Nights. And Everything Everywhere All at Once is absolutely one of those examples, and a great example of what can be accomplished when you don't do a straight shot from A to B to C. I mean, what would this story be if it were a linear story following one timeline? Well, I mean, it would just not be the same.
It wouldn't be a story. Yeah, it'd be like,
you'd eviscerate the soul of it.
Can you just describe for the audience, either one of you, more details about what is a spiral structure and what is a nested structure? Just so I feel like I'm kind of on the edge of guessing or knowing what that might be, but it might be better to actually spell it out so that we're sure that we're all using the same terms.
Okay, instead of talking abstracts, let's look at two examples. The first one is the 1001 Nights. So within the 1001 Nights, there are many stories and stories within stories and stories within stories within
And this
stories.
is when, how old, like, give us some context. This is a
This
long
is
time ago
1,300
written.
years old. Yeah, the
1300.
1001, yeah, the 1001 Nights, the oldest Persian version is 1,300 years old. So this is an old structure. The stories that we are collected as the 1001 Nights could have originated from the Muslim world, from Persia, from possibly India, possibly even some of the stories from China. But they are essentially an Asian story when we look at Central Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. Anonymously written collection of stories that developed a center of gravity over time. I'm sure that not one person wrote all of the stories that we now receive as 1001 Nights. There are many stories in there, different authorship, different time periods, different centuries, but they have coalesced around each other as this body of work that the world has crowdsourced as belonging together, and that we now call the 1001 Nights. But the 1001 Nights is not just about one character or a character and an antagonist and only about them. No, it dives into stories within stories that have nothing to do, seemingly, with those two main characters. And then those stories within those stories tell other stories, and it nests deeper and deeper and deeper. So it becomes a collection of stories that somehow hangs together, stories that somehow have a relationship with each other, despite the fact that they don't have the same characters, they don't take place in the same location, same time, around the same situation. That would be an example of a nested story. An example of a circular story would be something that is slightly tighter, that has the same characters, same situations, same location, etc., but is somehow revisiting over and over again. And the classic example would be the film Groundhog Day, where we have the same characters, but we are cycling again and again and again and remixing those relationships with each pass.
So interesting. Is there a more like modern version of a nested story that people can think about like now?
Television has been gleefully irreverent in terms of structure, but to go back to PJ's original case study, the most classic modern example of a nested or circular story is Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's fundamentally a mother-daughter story around this loose theme of potential. The mother, played by Michelle Yeoh, had these expectations regarding her. I don't remember if she was actually biologically her daughter in the Alpha universe, but was definitely her protege, her child figure, her mentee, and saw great potential in this prodigy. But that potential ended up being quite crushing to her mentee, and caused her mentee to go on a spree, a destructive spree across universes, because the expectations laid on her by this parental figure were not inspiring, but in fact crushing. Okay, so that's what the film is about fundamentally. It's fundamentally about two characters, mother and daughter figures, and this idea of what potential can do, what parental expectations can do to somebody. Does it inspire them? Does it crush them? And we could have had a sensitive, realistic story that just followed this domestic situation very
That was the
traditionally.
Joy Luck.
That's Joy Luck Club.
That was the Joy Luck Club.
Which is
It was
also
a great movie. I love that movie.
Joy Luck Club is a nested story because we've got four sets of mothers and daughters. Great example. But, okay, Everything Everywhere All at Once it's this gonzo, orgiastic explosion of like everything you can, every genre you can think of, every tone you can think of. You've got dildo jokes with the most subtle and exquisite acting. You've got kung fu sequences with these incredibly sensitive shots of longing and regret. It's every tone, every genre, every style put together. Why? What does that add? to this fundamental mother-daughter story about potential? Well, in my opinion, what it adds by embracing this nested structure where we get to see them in different alternate universes where they explored particular potentials is that we get the full impact of the what if. Instead of just thinking, okay, what if I had been kinder to my daughter? Or the daughter's thinking, what if I had understood that my mother wanted nothing but the best for me? The what if is shown, not just told in the abstract. And so we are able to inhabit it and regret that we didn't make those choices harder, more poignantly, because we see them. And so this is an example of how this nested storytelling, where we're wandering off into kung fu stories, we're wandering off into a planet where biological life never developed, and now the mother and daughter are two rocks. We get to actually see them. They get to inhabit those alternate universes. And we feel that fundamental relationship between the mother and the daughter, and then this idea of potential and what it can do, the manifold aspects of potential. We see it rather than being told about it in the abstract. And this is why it hits so much harder.
You know, as you're talking, I'm also thinking that the world was ready to receive that also. You know, and that's probably true with all art. It's like that pops, you know, that like its time had come and people had started to see the world in that. For me, I'm on TikTok a lot, and one of the things I like about it is you can just scroll and you do see like all this stuff randomly crash into each other, and it seems not a fantasy. It seems like that's the way the world is. You walk outside and all this random stuff is crashing into each other, and so maybe we as a society collectively we're finally ready to take that in. I hypothesize.
That's very interesting. I had not thought of it that way. I mean, people who have grown up with digital media, maybe their brains are primed for nonlinear stories in a way that mine was not.
PJ, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was going to say, you know, we were talking about how these kinds of structures are often discovered when we were talking about Four-Act by people in the West because it really served the story they were trying to tell. And I'm thinking of nested stories, and my favorite nested story is, one could say, the beginning of the entire speculative fiction genre in a big way, and that was Frankenstein. And the effect it had is similar to what we're talking about, where monsters had, up until this point, been simply monstrous because they'd been a crime against nature, against God's will, blah, blah, blah. But what Shelley did was she put in a nested structure, the beginning and the ends are the story of the sea captain in the Arctic. Then the next layer around the middle is Victor Frankenstein's story. So it's a story of this scientist who has created life and abandoned it and is, in my words, the exemplar of the deadbeat dad. Shelley absolutely had problems with her own father and husband, but also the crime of that. You know, what happens when you abandon your children and the rest of that. But the really center of the story, the literally dead center, is the creature. And he's telling his own story. More eloquently, may I add, than anyone else in the story, more heartfelt, more empathetic, because Victor's an asshole and a monster himself. I mean, he's clearly sociopathic, or at least simply uncaring about everything around him. Whereas the monster only becomes monstrous because he hasn't been well brought up. And you have such incredible empathy. And she was basing her ideas about that, ironically, from Paradise Lost, because Milton so brilliantly made Satan the most fascinating character in the entire story. You know, Adam's a milquetoast. You couldn't care less what happens to Adam or Eve. And you don't even agree necessarily with Satan's bad metaphysical arguments, but you feel for him. And that's what she does even more extraordinarily in Frankenstein, so that you understand that the creature is the heart and soul in that physical structure, but also is the asteroid you've dropped storytelling wise, because we all think we know what that creature is, and we have absolutely no idea of its inner life until the center of the story, and it changes everything from that point on. And, so I love how that was the only way she could figure out how to tell that story.
Interesting. I had never thought, I mean, I love Frankenstein. Frankenstein rocked my world for many, many years. In part because of the, I don't know, like casual confidence of it. Mary Shelley's like, okay, you guys, you're thinking about all these themes. Well, here you go. This is what you're trying to say, right? It's just like perfectly.
And she's a
captured all of
teenager.
that. A teenager, yeah. It was just a clear work of inspiration. But I had never thought of the actual shape. And now that you show me the shape, thank you for this. We've got the outer account from the captain, and that's icy, right? That's like literally icy, because they're in the Arctic region. So it's literally ice encasing the story. And then within that, we've got Victor's Frankenstein. He's icy in a different way, emotionally icy. And then we get into the heart of the story, and you've got this burning rage that is the heart of the story. Inside, encased in layers of ice, there is fire, there is rage, and it's completely understandable. So I had never seen the beautiful shape of the story before. Thank you for that.
I wonder if she could have told the story any other way and have the same kind of impact. Like so many people take that story and make the 3-act structure. You think of the movies of Frankenstein. I mean, those are pure 3-act structure. What you can do is shift point of view more easily in a film so that you have moments with the creature where you're getting a sense of who they are also in performance. I guess it's Boris Karloff. They stripped the monster of all his eloquence in the original James Whale film, and they made the creature mute. But his acting is so filled with pathos, and he's like, I'm not gonna let the audience not feel for me. I'm sorry. I don't care, director. I don't care, screenwriters. I don't care, studio. I'm going to make you all feel for me. So there are those moments in filmmaking where you're allowed to give the audience information that you might not be able to in the novelistic structures. Mm-hmm. But or the comedy versions. I mean, even in those, they're extremely linear. Like Young Frankenstein, right? You get to see that creature in bed with the girlfriend, and you get to have all these moments that are actually quite fun and tender, and you see he's actually the better boyfriend than Victor ever would be, and it's so they have this marvelous way of breaking out from 3-act structure, but it's still, it's as linear as all get out. There's no nesting within the actual story of the films. So, but the impact is so much more powerful in the novel.
Because our expectations are subverted. We were led down a path, and then the monster gets the microphone, and he says, "You were told lies. You want to hear what really happened? Let me tell you."
Right. Exactly right.
And it's only because we were complicit in the expectations and the prejudices that we get the full impact of the monster's long soliloquy, essentially bearing his soul and his rage. And by the end of you know what? You deserve your rage. You're like, go get him.
Yeah. I have a couple questions, or one question that's a couple questions. So we're talking about 3 acts and 4 acts, and my mind is like, well, what about the 5? What about the 6? What about the 2? I know that there's a thing called a 1 act. That's like a 1 act play, or maybe it's the same as a short story as a 1 act. But yeah, what's the case for more acts?
The most acts I've ever seen is Raiders of the Lost Ark, which has 7. But that also emphasizes the episodic nature of where it comes from. It comes from the serial, the movie serial.
And it felt like it. It felt like it to me. So, I mean, at some point, I think that the structure does kind of dissipate, or it becomes beside the point.
I mean, maybe that's not a useful question. I don't know. It just had me thinking.
I think there are two aspects to it, and it depends on the media you're talking about. One is short by its nature. Two is very common in let's say you see it in theater a lot in musicals. So musicals are two-act structure, and that is because there's an intermission in the middle.
Right.
Television, 1 hour television, was traditionally four-act structure, not the same as Kishotenketsu. The second and third acts were basically linked as kind of a common act. But those acts were based on commercial breaks.
Yeah.
So you would create a little
Those are
cliffhanger.
artificially made structures, so it's not the story that's dictating the structure that's necessary. It's the external package dictating the structure.
So many forms of storytelling are like that anyway. I mean, you can look at poetry, and that's all about the structure it takes, and then working within this incredibly tight structure, whether it's syllabic, whether it's rhyming, however you're working with the confines
Yeah.
of the format, it dictates in many ways the kind of story you can tell and the kind of structure you might want. What I think is interesting about the difference between 3 and 4 act structure is that they can be the same length of story. Like you can see that in movies, like it's 2 hour movies, 90-minute movies.
Right. Or a novel that's 212 pages or something.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you actually talk about 4 act structure in novels. The action adventure novel is traditionally 4 acts. Like if you break down things like The Martian or a lot of the techno thrillers, etc., they actually are technically 4 act structures, but again, not Asian structure, not the boom in the 3rd act. And you can kind of pretend it is because the escalation has happened so much, but it's different. You aren't living this life in the first 2 acts and exploring this life in the first 2 acts and then out of nowhere, boom. It's the escalation to just the biggest climax before you hit the 3rd act. I think it really has to do with a whole bunch of choices in the media format, in the type of story you're telling, the number of characters that are in your story, which can or may not dictate it, but it can. Shakespeare's 5 acts. Almost all Shakespeare's 5 acts, because I think for him, he felt that was the progression that worked best, and also, who knows, there might have been breaks in those acts. I'm actually not familiar enough with actual period performance to know if there were breaks, or did everybody in the ground, the groundlings, did they just stand there for the whole 4 hours of Hamlet, or were there breaks
For like food and
right,
exactly.
food, drink, like bathroom breaks,
Discussion. Yeah.
right.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Right. But I do think that acts are, as stories evolve in different media, we find the things that work most effectively. And especially when outside forces like advertising, like even just on a YouTube video, like we see advertising pop in all the time and we go, oh, you're in the middle of a thought.
The problem with YouTube is they're not planned. It's so it literally will be in the middle of a word.
Yeah.
Oh,
Not
totally.
even in the middle of at the end of a sentence. Like unlike old-fashioned television, it actually sets place for a commercial break, where YouTube is it's super irritating.
But I do wonder if eventually that's going to change. I do wonder if people will start building out, and right, do you know what I'm saying? Like they'll
Coordinating
be
with YouTube.
right,
for a
exactly.
place. Well, I think YouTube, the algorithm put by machines is the one who's determining, where to shove the commercial, which is why it can literally break in the middle of a word.
You were talking originally about the idea of, why should something rhyme? It seems like such an artificial constraint on free expression. And we were talking before, but Laura, when you originally asked about how many acts is too many, or should we have an infinite number of act structures? I remember Chopin was complaining about, why does why does everything have to be a symphony or a sonata or whatever? It's very, very regimented. These shapes that all of human expression is allowed to fit into. But on the other side, I kind of am interested in just constraints generally and seeing how people struggle against those constraints, because I think tension and release is inherently interesting. And I remember once in high school asking, I don't remember what we were reading, some Shakespeare, and I was asking, well, why are they doing this artificial thing of making it rhyme? I know that it helps the actors remember the lines, but I mean, fundamentally, is that not a huge artificial constraint on the expression possible with this material? And the teacher paused and he came up with something brilliant. He said, have you ever played tennis without a net? And I said, yeah, I actually have. And he said, not much fun, is it? And then I got it. Okay, I get it. It's our struggle against the constraints that is what we do with whatever constraint we are given. That's the most interesting.
I mean, I can think of so many examples from, like, the first example would be a diamond. Hello. Has, of course, the most constraints, arguably, on the physical reality, and look what it makes. But also, like, if you watch any kind of reality show where it's a creator show, like, they'll give the creators, here's $1,000 in 3 days, make whatever you want. And they struggle, right? And it's like, here's a torn up rag in 15 minutes, and they soar or something. Here, make this lunch out of these 4 ingredients that are found from the dumpster. Go.
And one of them has to be blue. The constraints.
The art that comes out is oftentimes,
It's so important to have constraints to make art. I actually don't know if you can make art without it. And the constraints can be physical or they can be philosophical, but there's got to be, example. So I learned how to tell stories through Hollywood, and I was a movie and television executive, and then I had an asteroid drop on my life, which was my husband saying, we're going to New Zealand. I'm going to be making these telemovies based on Hercules. And that led to a series of Hercules and a series of Xena Warrior Princess. And, I'm living down there and have nothing to do. And I've never written anything in my whole life, but I've been teaching writers how to write screenplays. I've been actually guiding and story editing and doing nothing but screenplay work my whole career. So I figured, well, let's see if I can write. Well, you internalize those structures, like that how long 10 minutes is on a page, and you have to know those things because you have to work to the act breaks. You have to work to the commercial breaks. Everything needs to be in this incredibly tight format. And I found it remarkably easy because I'd internalized those structures. And then I decided to take one of the stories that my agents loved but hadn't sold and turned it into a novel. I didn't know how to write a novel. I'd never written prose in my entire life. And it took me a long time to teach myself how to write prose because I thought, I'm losing the constraints. I'm ripping my corset off. I no longer have minutes and page count. And oh my God, this is incredible. And my favorite writers are like Dickens and Trevanian, who digressions galore. And it was terrible because I had forgotten that constraint is everything. And it wasn't until I started thinking again about how do I know how to tell a story in as constrained and tight a sense as possible, even though it was a big epic story. How do I do that?
I remember PJ would do this on social media. You'd post something like, I'm going into my little hidey house and I'm not going to come out for a week because I'm writing. So not only did you put constraints psychologically, you physically constrained yourself in an airstream or something, like locked the door.
I discovered the only way I could actually make anything was through constraint at every level, mental, physical, structural, all of it. That goes back to what you're asking, Laura, of like this nature of constraint. It's so crucial. Even going back to the famous Michelangelo line, I don't carve something out of stone. I release it. I remove the stone to reveal what's hiding inside it. That's the ultimate constraint.
I wish I knew more about our brains. I wish I knew more about neurology. I wish I knew more about evolution and biology, because I see this happen with animals. You know, like I'm a godparent to my best friend's dog, and he's got this one particular treat that's good for his joints, and he's just sick to death of it. He has it every day. He's sick to death of it. You put it down there, and you know most dogs will eat anything you put down, but he was like, okay. I mean, I guess I will eat it. However, all I have to do is take one of those treats and let him watch me wrapping it up in a sock, and his eyes get wider. And then I take that sock and I put it inside a toilet paper roll, and his eyes get even wider. And then my best friend covers his eyes, and I go and hide that under something. And when we release him, he is about to explode with enthusiasm and excitement over this thing that he wouldn't have he touched it otherwise. You know, those constraints, maybe it's the illusion of meaning, but I don't think I think that's too cynical. It's not about the treat. It's about what it reveals in us, what ingenuity it can bring out.
Novelty.
Novelty and invention.
Yes.
Novelty in the situation, invention in our response to the situation. That's fundamentally the treat that we are looking for. It can be very satisfying to get a note from a studio executive saying, what the hell is this guy talking about? He has no idea about anything about psychology. This is not how people talk. But then you just sit back and you swallow your pride and think, you know what? I found a way. And that can be incredibly satisfying. I just feel like we are wired as a species to solve problems, even with these seemingly insurmountable constraints, even these seemingly very unfair artificial constraints. They can be satisfying to struggle against. So I think that that's partly what's happening.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
think if textbooks were written, like the science textbooks, for example, about the asteroids and the, mass extinction during the Cretaceous, if they were written as a narrative with, birds and dinosaurs in there, then students might be more engaged in understanding about the beaks and the seeds than they would be if it was just told as kind of a boring paragraph in a textbook.
Well, what I love about what you are doing with the new mythos is looking at how different disciplines can make each other more effective, how storytelling can help with science education. And I think of this in other aspects because I have had a number of different careers. I was an attorney, I was an art dealer, now I'm an author and instructor. And people say, well, you're giving me whiplash by just talking about these career changes. But for me, they are united by a couple of things. One of them being they're all about telling stories.
They are all telling stories.
Yeah,
sure,
yeah,
sure.
absolutely. And as an attorney, I have to learn how to tell a compelling story, and I have to make the stakes understandable to the judge or the jury, and I have to make this the most gripping story possible because somebody's life or livelihood or business is on the line. Storytelling. And same thing with art. I found that as an art dealer, people might have a very strong reaction emotionally to an artwork, but they needed the words from somebody who was articulate in art parlance to make their feelings real. And so I was tasked with helping to reduce to words, to a story, the amorphous, nebulous feelings swirling inside of their hearts and their stomachs and their brains to get them to the point where they were comfortable opening up their checkbook.
Henry, you are extraordinary. I love your work. I love your writing, fiction and nonfiction. And I urge our audience to seek out not just Henry's writing, but also his teaching.
Yes.
Phenomenal teacher. Phenomenal. I am an alumni.
Thank you.
Well, I've taken so many classes at the UCLA Writers Extension, but only nonfiction.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I'm scared of fiction.
I've got one coming up for all of you viewers out there and listeners. I teach at the UCLA Extension Writers Program, and they allow me to do these freaky one-off free 3-hour classes online about once a quarter. And I've got one, I've got a reprise of one that is about Jungian dream analysis and writing, how we can harness Jungian dream analysis to make our writing, fiction, nonfiction, prose, screenplays, poetry, more itself. And this was the most alive 3 hours I think I've ever had before, filled with unnameable emotion. I was in tears. The class was in tears at the end of this 3-hour class, and none of us had a name for the emotion.
Wow.
And that
Are
was
you doing
that
it
was,
again?
I'm doing it. I'm doing. They're letting me offer again. I believe in February of 2026. But if you look at my website, it'll get updated with that.
Wonderful.
Oh, man, I'm signing up.
I know, me
it's
too.
it's a journey. It absolutely is a journey. I don't know where to, but far.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a fantastic journey in and of itself. Henry, thank you. Thank you, audience, for listening. Please like and subscribe and come back for more Love Letters to the Future. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.